I've spent the last couple weeks pouring dozens of hours into the new Tokyo Xtreme Racer, and now I can finally share my thoughts on this reboot of one of my favorite childhood game series. I've done just about everything you can possibly do within the current early access build, and in this video we'll talk about all the ups and downs of the game, as well as touching on performance, Steam Deck compatibility, game length, car list, number of rivals, and so much more. That said, I want to start by giving you a completely spoiler-free 1-minute review of my time with TXR 2025 so far. This newest game is Tokyo Xtreme Racer in every sense of the word, both the good and the bad, but undeniably a full-bodied TXR experience. TXR 2025 is a safe return to the series. It doesn't take any major risks, but instead gathers the essence of the older games like 0, 3, and ITC, distilling them into a modern TXR, with many smaller iterations and quality of life updates that longtime fans will be very happy to see. TXR 2025's somewhat dated presentation and smaller scale might be a turnoff for gamers less familiar with the rest of the series, but I feel that for most, it will instead be a welcome departure from the recent trend of big budget AAA festival racers that have mountains of content, but a lack of heart. Heart and soul have always been at the core of Tokyo Xtreme Racer, and I'm happy to say that this newest iteration is no exception. It remembers everything that made the old games great and brings that into the modern era. For only $30 in early access, this is one of the strongest recommendations I can make if Japanese cars, highway racing, and over-the-top anime tropes are your style. So there you have it. TXR really is back. It's truly impressive to me how effortlessly Genki was able to pick up right where they left off. It's like not seeing a childhood friend for years after leaving your hometown, but then you travel back after college and run into them, and maybe they haven't changed quite as much as you have, but you still fall right back into your old shenanigans, and it's like you never missed a beat. Now, as we're about to dive into some more details, it's very important to put a big asterisk on pretty much everything I say in this video, because this is early access, and I've been playing builds even older than what you can probably download right now. I will bring up some criticisms, but it's entirely possible that some of them will be addressed in patches or updates throughout the early access period and through player feedback. I also want to say to existing TXR fans, stop watching this video and go experience the game for yourself. Yes, this is worth the price if you know you already like TXR, and while I won't get into any story specifics, I don't want to accidentally spoil a lot of the exciting moments that longtime TXR fans will undoubtedly experience while playing. Alright, let's get started with the gameplay loop and handling model. Like I said, I did beat the early access, which takes you right up to the end of stage 2, and that took me a little over 20 hours at a pretty rushed pace. I'd expect the average player to beat stage 2 in between 20 to 30 hours, depending on how much you mess around customizing cars or grinding for money or whatever else. With that said, stage 3 is looking like it will be another 10 to 20 plus hours of content, just based on how many rivals I've already beaten in stage 2 and how many are presumably left for the rest of the game. We'll touch on that more later, but for now, let's just kind of walk through the gameplay loop. If you're familiar with the old games, especially up to Import Tuner Challenge, then not too much here will surprise you. For a starter car, you can choose between a modern Suzuki Swift or MX-5, but come on, I know you know you, and I know you know that I know you're gonna pick a Panda Trueno as your starter car. From there, you're dropped into a familiar yet much more modern TXR experience. We've got a nice looking garage space and can bring up a nav menu to customize our car, access the settings or career stats, and whatever else. We'll get back to all this later, but for now, from the garage, we can head right out onto the highway. And right away, you'll see a lot of quality of life improvements. What you're seeing here is the fully unlocked map. You'll start with access to just the C1 loop and a few entrance ramps, but will over time gain access to everything else, including parking areas, which have returned from ITC. Possibly the best feature is the ability to see all your rivals on the map. and you can use that along with the Objectives tab or Rivals tab to get a really good idea of what you should do to progress. This is by far the most accessible TXR because all the info is right here and easy to digest. It just makes for a much smoother gameplay flow, but still doesn't take anything away from the game. Like, rivals you haven't seen yet just show up as question marks, and bosses or team leaders will still pop up right behind you out of the blue. Jumping onto the highway, we can talk a bit about handling. This is a very solidly arcade handling model. If I'm to compare it to any of the older games, it reminds me most of Zero, but with more grip and a really strong downforce feeling. The cars are super grippy and very responsive without too much momentum or weight to them. You essentially can't brake rear traction without ripping the handbrake, and even front-wheel drive cars don't understeer much at all. It feels good because it feels really easy and quick. Dodging through traffic or speeding around tight corners feels nice because every car feels like a supercar, but on the flip side, there isn't too much depth or challenge to it. In previous TXRs, especially 3 for example, the C1 loop felt tight and technical and could certainly be scary in some spots, but in this game you can fly through the whole thing without much of any worry. I think people are going to be split on this because on the one hand it is very approachable to where anyone can drive the cars well and have a good time, but for people looking for that challenge, the handling might feel unfulfilling or unrewarding. The drifting is kind of wonky as well because of that strong downforce self-centering feeling without a lot of momentum. Drifting in Zero, for example, felt much more intuitive. In this game, as it stands right now, you can kick the rear end out, but it's just so hard to keep the car sideways. It always wants to straighten back up, even with a very drift-focused setup. Ultimately, the handling may be easier than it's ever been, but it's still exciting, especially at the higher levels. And even at its worst, it doesn't get in the way of my enjoyment of the game whatsoever. But I would like to see some smaller tweaks made to that self-centering downforce effect and the grip level, so that tire choice, tire wear, car choice, tuning, and of course, skill level all play a bigger role in how well you can tackle the highway. Speaking of, let's talk about tires and some of the other on-the-road features. TXR 2025 does bring back tire choice, and this time you can freely pick between softs, mediums, and hards every time you go out, which I think is the best way to handle that system. You do still pay to upgrade your tires, but that's an overall upgrade. You don't have to pick between soft or hards, for example. Soft tires will last you maybe 4 to 5 battles on average, whereas hards can easily push you up to 10 plus, depending on how quickly you can end each battle. Right now, the tire wear and choice don't really matter too much. Even with fully shot hard tires on a high power Supra, I can still navigate tighter corners, and there is some noticeable difference, but again, just bringing it back to the overall handling, there is so much grip in the game that even at the lowest grip level, it still feels grippier than, say, TXR3 or Street Supremacy. That aside though, there are some really cool new features available to us on the road. You know how back in the old games you could leave the results screen open and your car would just keep driving and racking up miles? That was a sort of exploit you could do, but now it's just a feature. Hit down on the D-pad on controller at any point, and you'll go into autopilot mode. Such a nice little QOL update, and I love using this instead of the pause menu when I need to answer a quick text on my phone or something. Aside from that, left and right on the D-pad give us left and right turn signals, and up gives us flashers. Always love seeing those smaller details. Let's work through the camera options quickly here too. You've got a close chase cam, far chase, bumper, and hood cam. No interior this time around, but I'm a third-person controller pleb anyway, so I'm unbothered. And the hood cam is plenty for whenever I do want to break out the sim rig. You can look behind you and 90 degrees to each side, and a lot of folks have brought up that the camera is a bit stiff, which I totally agree with. I think this, combined with the pretty excessive camera shake at high speeds, will definitely be on the feedback list for Genki to fix in early access. And I feel like this is also a good spot to mention that the sense of speed is pretty solid, especially with some tweaks to the FOV settings, and hitting nitrous feels amazing. It has all the drama that it should. Alright, now moving on, we have more great new open world features. We now have time attacks organically in the open world, alongside speed cameras as well. So there's no separate time attack mode like we saw in some of the older games. You're just always being timed whenever you drive through a sector on the highway. And then this is recorded for you to look at in the garage. We'll check that out more in a little bit, but this is a great move to centralize everything in the game into one main open world experience. Alright, now let's talk about battles. There are a few main types of cars you can battle in the open world, and one of them is brand new. So you've got your team members, the standard rivals that'll be all over the map. Then you have wanderers, solo drivers that have special requirements to race against. Then you've got team leaders that will usually appear after you've taken down the rest of that team. And you have bosses, usually signifying some bigger career progression. But there is one more type of car you can race against in the open world: the traffic. Yes, that's right, you can race against literally any car on the road, even the utility vehicles. And this is a pretty big change for the pacing of TXR's gameplay, because you no longer need to drive half of the Bayshore line just to get to your next rival. You can race traffic and earn money all the way down. Once you hit the mid-game, all the traffic cars are insanely easy to beat, and I'm really curious if we'll see any progression to this mechanic, but for now, it is a kinda goofy but very welcome change. It makes it so much easier to just jump in and start racing and earning money, which I think is a net positive. For the actual battle mechanics, drivers will not lose SP until they're 25 meters behind, and initially SP does drain somewhat slowly, but there are skills and perks that can change that. We'll look at that later. I think the SP bar balance is very good across the board, with one exception, and that is hitting other traffic. Hitting walls or wall riding can drain your SP very quickly, but slamming into a poor traffic car at 100 miles an hour will barely tick down your bar. And I think personally that the penalty should be higher for that. And on that topic, just to speak on traffic density, I do think they struck a pretty good balance here. The traffic is often heavy enough to be an obstacle and create some hairy situations, but not too dense to where it's always slowing you down and becoming a nuisance. If anything, I'd like to see a bit more density on some of the wider and faster roads, and also a bit more variety. Say, maybe on Fridays and Saturdays in-game, the traffic is heavier, or perhaps just different parts of the map have different dynamic traffic levels, in order to add or reduce the challenge in certain areas. And speaking of challenge, to talk about overall game difficulty, I found that the early game was reasonably hard. I certainly had to play smart and choose my battles, and did lose some. However, once I unlocked and purchased one of the boss cars midway through stage 1, the entire rest of the game became very easy. That boss car and every other car I bought all the way to the end of stage 2 led me to a comfortable 100% win rate. And while a certain level of power fantasy is fun, and I think I got kind of lucky with my strong car choice, as I've been saying a bit already, the challenge just isn't quite there as much as I would want. However, I do think this is very likely to change before release, because I even noticed a few small things like the rivals never using nitrous, which could certainly up the challenge assuming that ability gets added in. And even throughout the 2-week period that I've been playing up to now, they've already tweaked balance in some areas. The AI in TXR 25 is generally pretty good though. In previous games they were notorious for not cornering well or slamming into traffic, and while some of that does still exist, it's much less frequent, and I often found myself being impressed with how well they navigated through some tight spots. Now throughout the night, you'll wear through tires and burn through nitrous, so you can stop at a parking area for a little refresher. This is a returning feature from ITC and sort of TXR3 with some new features and new areas. It's amazing to see Daikoku in TXR. From the parking area, you can refill your nitrous and buy a fresh set of tires. You can also adjust your tune on the fly, and in some areas, you can speak with a tuner who will give you temporary upgrades just for that night, which is a great way to get that little extra boost you might need to beat a particularly tough rival. You can also chat with other drivers to get some lore, tips, or most importantly, details on how to challenge some of the Wanderers. Now, I want to take just a minute to bring this up while we're here. This TXR leans so much heavier into the lore of its universe, and I love this change. In all the previous TXRs, the lore and story was there, but not really in your face. It was kind of like a Dark Souls game where you had to search it out and put the pieces together and make those connections between the teams and drivers. Whereas in this game, the world building and story is so much more front and center. The cutscenes, post-battle dialogue, rival bios, and of course these parking areas all add so much depth to the world and the drivers, which makes this a great entry point for people unfamiliar with the history of every single rival, but also an amazing experience for fans that already know a lot of the story up to this point. TXR 25 really pushes the world forward and expands on a lot of stories. And let me tell you, just as a teaser, the end of Stage 2, which marks the end of the current early access, has a very cool reveal that I can't wait to see them expand on later in the game. Alright, back to the parking areas. There is one more thing we can do here, and that is to battle more rivals. Team members and Wanderers can show up here, and this is where many unique battles can also take place. TXR 25 brings back multi-battles and sequential battles, where you're either racing multiple drivers at once or battling them in sequence back to back with a single SP bar. Now before we head back to the garage to talk about some other things, I do just want to end with a couple more thoughts on the open world in TXR 25. For one, weather and time of day both seem to be absent. There's no rain or different weather effects, and really just one static skybox. This is definitely something they might be planning on adding in later though, and I would love to see some different times of the night, different skyboxes, and to see rain return as well. Also, just because I know I'll probably see comments about it, engine temps have not returned either, which, you know, I think, yeah, it would be neat to have back, but I never really missed it in my time playing. Finally, I do want to see a bit more of a gameplay reason to stay out for longer sessions each night. All the features are there to support it. You know, you have so much to do now in the open world, and you have the tire and nitrous mechanic with the parking areas for pit stops, but you don't really gain anything for staying out longer. And I think maybe some credit multiplier or something could be a good incentive to encourage players to stay on the road instead of just jumping back to the garage after each battle. And with that, let's jump back to the garage and check out the results screen. First off, cool new QOL feature. We can now sort of pick our bad names. Every time you earn a new name, you can choose to take it or keep your old one. So if you have a name you really like, you can keep it throughout the whole playthrough. Now for the results screen itself, this is a very nice summary of all your battles, the money you made and where it came from. You can look at any new sector or speed trap records you set, and you can see how many battle points you earned. This is an all new feature that I love. These are essentially skill points that can be spent on skills and perks. You get them for beating new rivals, but can gain them in a couple other ways too. These are spent in the perks menu, which has 5 different categories. This first one is pretty straightforward. You can spend battle points to either slow down the rate at which your own SP bar drops, or speed up how quickly your rivals drops. Next we have skills, and there's tons of these. You can increase the size of your SP bar, increase money made from certain battles, earn money for driving long distances, reduce tire wear, reduce SP drain for hitting walls, and much more. The catch here is that only one of these can be equipped at a time, so it's up to you to decide which of these skills is the most important. Moving on, we then have perks, and this is where you can increase max wallet and garage size, as well as getting discounts on things like car purchases and tune-ups from the parking area. One thing here that I want to see is the removal of a credit limit at the highest rank. Right now it tops out at 15 million, which is totally reasonable, but I feel like at the end of the game with every perk unlocked, you shouldn't still be limited on how much money you can hold at one point. And the garage limit, by the way, tops out at 55, which is enough to own one of each car, as well as a few boss cars, but again, I see no reason not to just go further with that final perk level and let people have, say, 100 cars if they really want. Speaking of cars, you unlock them for purchase in the Machines tab, and here is essentially your complete car list. The cars are kind of sorted into tiers that unlock with career progression, so you can't just beeline it to a Supra, for example. And then we finally have the tuning section where upgrades are unlocked, and these follow a similar tier system. Overall, I can see people perhaps not enjoying this whole skill tree thing, but personally, as a huge RPG player, I love skill trees, so this is a fantastic addition to me. And if I had anything to say, it would just be that I would want to see perhaps more variety with the skills and upgrades, but it is totally fine as it stands now. You will also notice that Honda was missing from the roster, and there aren't any foreign cars either. Genki has responded to both of these questions and said that they're perhaps trying to work on a deal with Honda. I think there was some word that an NSX kit was scanned a while back or something, but either way, the roster of 48 cars is absolutely strong enough for now, and maybe we'll see more with future updates or DLC. Now, before we move on to car customization, let's just kind of run through these different nav menus. You've got the dealership that will show all your unlocked cars, including boss cars that you can buy, some of which I have found to be very powerful, and that's why they come at a premium. Then you can browse your owned vehicles and customize license plates. You can switch between a standard or backlit plate, and I don't think we had this in previous games. You can now select a business use plate as well. And then, as always, we can pick from any prefecture and select a number, and I like that it does limit you to only classification numbers that actually make sense for your car. Also worth mentioning here that you can sell cars, and there are even perks that increase the price you get for selling. And now we come to our reference page. This is where we can check out detailed rosters and stats for each driver we've encountered, and once you beat every driver in a team, you unlock their team bio. Now, this was something that recently changed in a patch, but previously we were actually able to see different driver numbers that showed us a total of at least 450 rivals. Genki has also said that only about half of the game's rivals are in the game now, which with 216 on my build would seem to line up pretty close to that 450 number. However, the Fuel Fest demo showed 291 rivals, and I'm almost wondering if the public early access will have that many too, but either way, at least 450 rivals is a great lineup. This window also shows us all of our segment and speed trap records, and you'll notice on the right this coming soon box with a grayed out leaderboard. Now, Genki did say that multiplayer wouldn't be in the game, but does that include online leaderboards? Because I do think that's what this could be, and it would be amazing to have online time attack boards for different segments along the highway. There's also a coming soon tab on the far right, and this was shown in the Fuel Fest demo to be a replay theater. Now, because there's no battle results screen after each battle anymore, I wonder if maybe replays will autosave instead. But either way, it does look like replays are returning for this game. Alright folks, now let's move on to car customization, starting with upgrades. This is a fairly familiar, if not slightly slimmed down, upgrade selection from the previous games. You'll unlock new tiers of upgrades throughout the game, and installing them often unlocks new tune settings. The tuning menu is great in TXR25 with some very good fitment settings and suspension adjustments that really let you dial in the fitment you want on your car. I love that we can select between a 1, 1.5, and 2-way diff, and can turn ABS on and off per car. Now let's get to the good stuff, aero. Again, we're working with a bit of a slimmed down selection here. Currently anyway, there's no option for things like headlights, mirrors, grills, or wide body fenders that we've seen in previous games. And exhaust customization is tied to the rear bumper instead of being its own thing or tied to performance exhaust upgrades, like we saw in previous games. That said, we do have a couple new options I'll get to in a minute. Now, most of the cars in the game currently have 3 parts per category. So 3 hoods, 3 side skirts, 3 wings, etc. However, sadly, some have less. The Mark III Supra, for example, only has 1 kit, although it's not like I really wanted to see that Mustang cosplay again. The existing kits are all fantastic, and overall, 3 options per car is pretty solid, but I would definitely like to see more here, and I'm hoping that the cars with less selection end up getting more kits before launch. I even wonder if perhaps they're planning to put visual customization behind Wanderer battles. We've seen things similar to this in past games, but currently in TXR 25, Wanderers don't unlock any unique upgrades. They just give you a big chunk of credits. So maybe they can solve 2 things at once by giving us more aero parts through beating rival Wanderers. Moving on though, we have some great neon customization, a lot of previous settings return, and we get a couple new ones as well. We also have some really nice caliper and rotor customization that can be separately adjusted between the front and rear wheels. You can pick between drilled or slotted rotors in multiple materials and can change their size, so you can have huge front brake setups that look really nice with your wheels. You can also heavily customize the calipers, picking from anything between 4-pot all the way up to 8-pot, or even a dual caliper setup, which is sick for those drift car builds. You can rotate the caliper anywhere you want around the rotor and pick its color. So we've got some great selection there. And then finally, let's move down to wheels. We can again customize the front and rear separately and have 11 brands currently to pick from. However, right now there are only 2 wheel choices per brand. I'm really hoping that they're planning to add more throughout the early access or near launch. One thing I love here though is the ability to select smaller than factory wheel sizes. You can go all the way down to like 12 inches on some cars. You can also select color, but right now it's only factory colors, and while I do love seeing all the factory options, some of which are pretty unique, I would also like to be able to choose custom wheel colors. And that actually brings us somewhat neatly into the paint and livery section. Factory paints are available for all cars, which is great, and here we can also select fully custom colors and finishes. There's a metallic and matte slider in the other colors window. This also applies to decals as well on a per decal basis, so you can have a gloss paint finish with a matte livery, but a couple of decals on that livery are metallic or whatever else. In many ways, this is just a step up from ITC's customization. All the old decals return, we've got the art factory decals and everything, and can freely place and layer tons of different things to create the livery that we want. It's not the most detailed system I've ever seen, but this is very easy to use with high quality decals and still has enough depth to make some really cool and detailed designs. And folks, that kind of brings us to the end of this section of the video. We've covered the main gameplay loop and all the major features, talked car list and customization, and now let's just throw on some B-roll while we chat about performance and visuals. First off, just to get this out of the way, this is an offline game. You do not need an internet connection to play whatsoever. So already a big win. Now, keeping in mind that this is early access, the performance has been a bit of a mixed bag, but largely very positive. TXR 25 is built in Unreal 5.4, but does not have a lot of the common issues we've seen lately from much bigger and better funded studios. I have this game installed on 4 machines. I'll throw up the specs on screen for each one. None of them stutter or crash at all, and all of them are able to hit a smooth 60, including the Steam Deck. which after a patch just last night got a roughly 20% performance boost and now runs a relatively smooth 60 on low settings. There is an issue currently with the actual game speed slowing down below 60 FPS. It's not really noticeable in the high 50s that you will hit sometimes on Steam Deck, but if you perhaps want to lock it to 30 or 40 FPS or something, you can clearly tell it's slowing down the entire game speed. And even though the game does run really well on some low-end hardware, it also doesn't seem to scale up too well with higher spec hardware. My primary gaming PC, for example, averages around 45 FPS on max settings at essentially 4K. However, at standard 16:9 1440p, it does float around the mid-80s. And this is all, for the record, without any upscaling or frame generation, which the game does support. We also have FXAA and DLAA on top of TSR, which is kind of a step up from TAA, but at a pretty heavy performance cost. Still though, it's great to see a couple of choices for my fellow TAA haters. Genki does seem to have a pretty solid grasp on developing games in Unreal, and I would expect some smaller optimizations to come throughout the rest of early access, but the simple fact that I have never had a crash in 30 plus hours on 4 machines, can run the game smoothly on my Steam Deck, and have experienced no stuttering is all enough to make me very satisfied with the game's performance. So now let's talk visuals and presentation. I will say that I don't love the current controller navigation where you have to use the joystick mouse for a lot of things. It's obviously serviceable, but could absolutely be tightened up a bit because it does slow down a lot of the menu navigation. Overall though, the UI design and visual style is really clean and gives me kind of a PS4 aesthetic for some reason that does actually carry over into a lot of how the game presents itself. In a way, TXR 2025 feels like it was actually a lost PS4 or Xbox One game that Genki just forgot about for a decade and then decided to release now. Existing TXR fans have long been stuck in the PS2 or Xbox 360 era though, so for us this is still a significant step forward for the series. The map in TXR 25 is a port from the older games, maybe ITC or Wangan Midnight, but it wasn't built from scratch for this release, and some of the car models are ported over from their older games as well. They've done a great job with paint materials though, so even the older models look pretty nice, and they did a fantastic job of lighting the world, actually changing it quite heavily throughout the early access that I've been playing. The reflections in the map also look very good, definitely benefiting from some of Unreal's toolkit there, and one of the very first things that stuck out to me when playing were the great parallax interiors on buildings all throughout the map, which really helps add depth and life to the scene. The overall visual style of the game is great. The color grading and reflections and lighting are all fantastic and really fit the TXR style. However, again, because this is a ported map from older games, but without the fog that the older games had and a much further draw distance, distant detail can certainly look rough. If you look off to the sides of the highway, really anywhere, you'll see floating buildings, super low poly roads and details, and very static billboard trees. You can also in some areas quite clearly see where the map and buildings end, which does pull me out of the immersion a bit. Even though the older games looked worse, obviously, some of them still had this static, distant skyline texture that gave you the impression that you were in a big city. And now that that's gone, the skybox just hits the horizon and you can see kind of where the world just falls off. I really don't expect any changes here. You know, Genki are very clearly using this game to get back on their feet and revitalize the series, so reused assets really don't bother me in this case. For me, performance and of course gameplay are infinitely more important, but like I said at the beginning of the video, this might be something that turns off players that want a more visually modern game. And I do think they still could implement a few tricks to help keep players from seeing some of those more immersion-breaking, low-detail areas of the map. Ultimately though, I really only have one major complaint, and you're gonna laugh, but I noticed this stuff. Currently, there are no trams, planes, or boats in TXR25. Previous games had working trams that would often cross over the player, and when you were near the Haneda airport, you could see planes taking off too. And I really miss these smaller world-building immersion moments. I hope this is just another thing Genki has planned, but just hasn't implemented yet, because it does go a long way to bring life to the world. Speaking of bringing life to the world, let's end by talking about the game's music and audio design. First off, the soundtrack is fantastic. TXR25's OST is largely composed of remixes from the older games, and they're really good remixes that remind you of the originals while also carving out their own style and energy. It's the perfect blend of honoring the old games without leaning on them for nostalgia too much. Existing and new fans alike should be very satisfied with the soundtrack. The audio design across the board has some ups and downs. Menu navigation sounds are crisp and stylish, but car audio is mixed. The nitrous effect is awesome, but I really want to hear a punchy shift sound and better rev limiters and a bit more engine audio variety. The engine sounds are fine, and you can tell a rotary from a V6, but there isn't quite as much depth and liveliness and variety as I want to see in the car audio. There also isn't much of any ambient audio in the world, just sounds of the city, and I think that's something else that could help bring Tokyo to life. At the end of the day though, you can just crank up the music and not worry about it. Alright dudes, this has been a very long video, so let's wrap up with some final thoughts. Tokyo Xtreme Racer 2025 is a shining bright spot in a racing game community that has struggled to feel excited about new releases in recent years. I think this is a game that will show players and hopefully studios that small scope, focused projects can still succeed as long as they're built with a strong direction and passion. I, like some of you, was worried when this new TXR was revealed that this might just be a hollow, rushed reboot relying on nostalgia to sell copies of an unfinished and unloved game. But that could not be further from the truth. Genki understood exactly what was needed to bring this franchise back, and they executed on it beautifully. Even in its early access build, with presumably only about a half to 2/3 of the game available to us, this easily earns its $30 price tag to me. I cannot wait to see what the rest of the game has in store and how Genki responds to player feedback and adapts the game throughout this relatively short early access period. Tokyo Xtreme Racer is back, and this feels like it's just the beginning of a new era. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.